All right, good evening. Glad to see all of you here. Again, appreciate you bearing with us last week as we went through a lot of history and things like that. It's not the end of the history that we're going to cover in this class, but we really wanted to make sure we set the stage for what's going on as we start to talk about Daniel chapter 1 tonight. Before we get into our lesson, and there are handouts there on the podium if you didn't grab one. Is there anything we need to pray about tonight? All right. Did you have? Okay. All right, let's pray. All right, so as we saw last week, Daniel has been brought to Babylon as an exile. We're in the year 605 BC. Babylon has defeated the Assyrians, the Egyptians. They are now the dominant world power. This is the first of 3 deportations of exiles, people of Judah and Jerusalem, to Babylon. It's going to happen again in 597. And then in 586, it's going to have the 3rd deportation, and along with that, the complete destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and all that. We talked about that last week. But what so many prophets have said leading up to this point is starting to come true, that if they did not repent and obey, they would be destroyed. And so that's taking place. Before we get into our text, Daniel chapter 1, we're going to try to cover as much of that as we can tonight. I thought it may be helpful for you to get a little bit of background about Babylon. Some people find that interesting, some don't. I'm not going to take too much time, but anybody know where Babylon is located in modern day? If you look on a modern day map, where Babylon is or was? Iraq. It's in Iraq, close enough. It's about 55 miles south of Baghdad. All right, so you probably remember seeing Baghdad in the news a lot. But it's situated in, and I realize the map is kind of small, but you're looking at the Arabian Peninsula, and I know you probably cannot read. Do I have a pointer on this? So the yellow portion or tan portion is the Babylonian Empire during this time. So you see Babylon, where Babylon is where modern day Iraq is. The Euphrates River ran through Babylon. But it was a very significant city. There was a Babylonian Empire that even predated this one. This was a relatively new Babylonian Empire. But there would have been very huge walls, in fact, 3 sets of walls. They were about 40 feet tall, and it said that they were so wide that they would run chariot races, or could have run chariot races across them. You can see, this is a fairly recent picture. There's been some renovations of the site, so some of it is ruins that were there, and some of it's been repairs. In fact, obviously there's been a lot of war going through Iraq, so a lot of the ruins have actually been damaged because of the more recent warfare. But that gives you an idea of some of the walls. There were several gates, several palaces. This is a picture of the ruins of, I think this is what they refer to as the Southern Palace, but Nebuchadnezzar, we're going to talk about, he had multiple palaces. There were multiple temples. There were multiple gates, I think about 8 gates. This is a artist rendering of what's called the Ishtar Gate, okay? This was a very lavish, obviously it's blue, so it would have been very, really would have stood out back then. This is an actual reconstruction of the gate that I think is in Berlin. But it was known for its architecture. It was a very large city in that day and age. It was likely the largest city size and population-wise. But this is where Daniel finds himself now. You may also have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. I don't have any pictures there because it's really not certain that they existed or that they were even in Babylon. There's a possibility it was actually in Assyria, but yet it's still one of the 7 wonders of the world. But let's move on from there. So let's get into our text. We already touched on the first couple of verses, but I'm going to pick up reading in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord handed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, over to him, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king told Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom there was no impairment, who were good-looking, suitable for instruction in every kind of expertise, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability to serve in the king's court. And he ordered Ashpenaz to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king also allotted for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and ordered that they be educated for 3 years, and at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. And to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. All right, so we see off the bat that Babylon takes stuff from Judah. All right, what do they take? They take the best of the people, right? The cream of the crop, as we might say. And they don't take them and make them slaves in kind of the sense we would often think of slaves. They're not, laying bricks and things like that. What are they going to do with these captives? They want to train them. And what eventually do they want to do with them? Yeah, but they want to serve the king, all right? So they're not going to be out working in fields or vineyards or anything like that. These are special young men that they want to turn into something productive, that they're going to be servants of the king. So also, what do we read that Nebuchadnezzar takes? What does he take with him from Jerusalem? Yeah, treasures from the temple, right? And what does he do with them? Puts them in his temple, places them in the temple with Babylon. So they're taking the best of the best in terms of the people. They're taking the treasures and taking them away to Babylon and placing them there. This is different than the Assyrians, who destroyed Israel. You can read in 2 Kings 17 what they did. What the Assyrians were known for doing was taking and putting people into the land that they had just conquered. So you read about the Assyrians bringing people into Israel, and they intermarried with the people that were left. They mixed their religions, and so that's how you got the Samaritans. All right, you always hear about the Samaritans when you come to the 1st century in the New Testament. The Jews and the Samaritans don't get along, and that's where that root that stems from. The Samaritans were people from the kingdom of Israel who had mixed in with people from all these foreign nations. But what Babylon is doing is they're wanting to take the best of the people they've conquered and make them assimilate into Babylonian culture. One of the things I think we want to note here is how much a lot of this is about religion. Okay, war in those days was all about religion. It was for the Israelites. If you think about why the Israelites fought their battles, why did they fight most of their battles? God told them to. All right, if you think about as the Israelites are coming into the promised land, God doesn't tell them to make peace with the people, form treaties. What does he tell them? Wipe them out, okay? And we can look at different battles throughout the history of Israel. We can look at battles that they won where God delivered them a victory because of their faithfulness, and we can look at battles that they lost because of their faithlessness. But war was very much about religion for God's people. But it was the same way when we look at the other nations in Babylon. You know, the fact that the Babylonians, the Assyrians didn't worship Jehovah did not mean that they were not religious people. We know that they had their gods, their idols. In fact, what was it that led the people of Israel astray? They were seeking after the gods of these foreign nations, right? So they were very religious, and they very much believed that the gods were involved in warfare and things like that, and the outcomes were determined by the gods. And so when we see Nebuchadnezzar taking these treasures from the temple and putting them in his temple, the temples to his gods, these are, in his mind, these are like trophies of war, a demonstration that my gods are the truly powerful ones. They've delivered me victory over your gods. And in a sense, Nebuchadnezzar is correct that there is a supernatural power behind all this. Because we read in the beginning of all this, and we talked when we went through our background, that it is God that raised up Nebuchadnezzar to do this. It is God that is in control behind the scenes. And so he's right that God is doing this. He's just wrong about which God. It's not his false gods. It's the one true God who's delivered Judah into his hand. So from what we read, what do we learn about Daniel? We're introduced to Daniel. Of course, we're talking about Daniel. What do we learn about Daniel from this passage that we just read? Yeah, so we read that description of who these people that they took, and it's Daniel and his friends that are among that group. So he fits right into that group. He's at the very least a noble, if not part of the royal family. What do we learn about his age? Yeah, we know he's young. We don't know exactly how old. I'd say he's probably a teenager at most. He's maybe early 20s, but he's a young man at most, but very likely a teenager. We know he's good looking. He's intelligent. The description is youths in whom there were no impairment. So they're like, specimens. If we were talking about college football recruiting, these are all 5-star recruits that are getting all the NIL money in the world thrown at them. But they're also suitable for what? Suitable for being taught in the ways, they're suitable for this program, so to speak, that they're going to be going through. But if we think about the situation Daniel's in, we know he's dragged from home, he's isolated, he's now in a foreign, wicked place. Although, as I've thought about this, I think it's, on some level, Daniel was used to being around wickedness. Because, this whole situation is brought about because of the wickedness of Judah. So it's not like that Daniel is, for the first time, being exposed to sinful, idolatrous people. But certainly being dragged away from home, means he's away from family, he's away from whatever support system he had that, helped bring him up as a faithful young man. He's gone from nobility to exile. All right, and of course the challenges are not going to stop there. So we're told that these young men are going to be entered into kind of a program, right? They're placed into an in-depth program, and the goal is going to be to turn them into productive members of the Babylonian court. And I think there's 3 prongs that we see into this program, 3 eyes, if that helps you to think about what's going on here. So first, of course, is isolation. All right, we talked about they're taken away from home, away from family, away from positive influences. We think about, a lot of us have probably experienced being homesick. You ever felt that? This was kind of forced homesickness, right? He didn't really have the ability to come home on the weekends, all right? But they're isolated. They're away from whatever positive influences they had in their life, except for perhaps themselves. Second thing we see is that the goal is to indoctrinate them. Indoctrination, all right? How are they going to indoctrinate them? Yep. Yeah. 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 If you look at the list of things that they do, they're going to teach them the language, the literature. They're going to, of course, get a diet, and that kind of sets the stage for the rest of the chapter. They're going to educate them in all these different things. I mean, if you were to take someone and bring them to America, and you wanted to put them through a 3-year program of what does it mean to be an American, you would hammer them with a lot of this stuff, right? I mean, one of the first things you'd want them to do is to learn English, right? You'd have them look at the literature. If you want to lump into literature, classic movies, classic American movies, that's kind of the modern day equivalent of literature. How central to a culture is diet, right? I mean, you go to Italy, what do you eat? Italian food, right? You can't experience Italy without Italian food, right? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Right. No, that's okay. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to talk about them hopefully. But this is not a crash course in these things. It's not like he's coming, he's staying for a week, learning what he can and got it done. This is how long? How long is this program? 3 years. I mean, that's how long I went to law school. That's how people go to college. This is a very in-depth program. They're going to be seemingly this is what they're doing, spending all of their time for 3 years doing. So this is not just to introduce, this is not like a vacation for them. This is a brainwashing, essentially. They're trying to take their Jewish worldview and replace it with a Babylonian worldview. What they think about God, what they think about life, what they think about morality, how to behave, trying to take what they've learned as a Jew and replace that with what they think is right as Babylonians, okay? So isolation, indoctrination, and then they're going to go after their identity, all right? We, of course, learn that they get new names, and I joked about, how we often know the Babylonian names, and I, on the spot, struggled to remember all their original names. I think we often get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego right, but we often, it's something about that just rolls off the tongue easier than Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, I guess. But we see that they're given new names. And going back to our idea that a lot of this is about religion, or really all of it's about religion, let's look at what their names meant. So Daniel's name means God is my judge. And his name that is given to him by the Babylonians is Belteshazzar. And what that means is may Bel protect the king, or Bel save the king. Bel being one of their Babylonian gods, okay? Hananiah means Jehovah is gracious, okay? He's doesn't become, but they give him the name of Shadrach, all right, which of course means shake the bed, right? Shake the bed, make the bed. I think that's why we remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Shake the bed, make the bed, and go to bed. No, Shadrach means illumined by Aku, which is one of their moon god in Babylon. Mishael means who is like God, whereas Meshach, his Babylonian name, is who is like Aku. So clearly a very intentional change there, okay? And then you have Azariah, Jehovah is my helper. His name given to him is Abednego, servant of Nego. So God is my helper, and then the change is to essentially helper of this foreign god. So you see in these names were of course very important to the Hebrews, to the Jews. They're important in pretty much any ancient society, it seems. But in each of their names, who do you see in their given names? You see God in their names. And then when they're given new Babylonian names, you see some variation of the Babylonian gods, right? So I think that has to be intentional, right? God is in the name of each of these boys, and they're given Babylonian names which incorporate these false Babylonian gods. If you think about names, they're very personal. I don't think names carry as much meaning today, now, as they did back then. I mean, a lot of us probably don't even know what our name means, and a lot of it's probably kind of made up anyway. But names are very personal to us, right? I'll confess, I don't think we really thought, I'll speak for myself, I guess, we never really thought we were going to name our son Redmond. Okay, we kind of had to name him Redmond so that we could get out of the hospital with a birth certificate. But something about Redmond, it's my middle name, it's a family name, so I'm very proud of it. But when I think of young child, I don't necessarily think of Redmond. But now that he is Redmond, I can't imagine it being anything else. I can't imagine, a name becomes so attached to us, so personal to us. So they're assigning them names, kind of going after this personal and religious connotation that they associate with their names. But what we see here is that they're not just trying to change things about them, they're trying to change these young boys at their very core. Who they are, they're trying to change their identity through all of this. But this is an all-out assault on the faith and character of Daniel and these men. They're trying to change the way they think, their religion, their identity. And notice, again, Drew mentioned the kind of trickle-down theory. Who are they? They're not starting with, kind of the old, worn-out people that are kind of leading quiet lives. They're starting with who? The young people who are the next generation of these people, people who they think are going to be impactful, who are going to be influential. But they're also what? What do we know about teenagers? Yeah, they're very impressionable, right? Young kids, even up to teenagers, are very impressionable. I mean, if you ever went off to college and you're away from home, that's in a lot of ways a shock, right? That's kind of what these guys are going through. Being away from home in a foreign place, presented with all these different things. So let me ask you, are there ways in which you think this is happening today? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody have any other ways in which you think that the world is kind of doing this, kind of putting people through this program or putting us? Yeah, school. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of things that I think people didn't have to grapple with until they were much older, that they're now being faced with in some way or another at a very young age. But I think we all probably know this, but if you don't, I hate to break it to you, but Satan, the devil, is not waiting for our children to become mature, Christian, established adults before he starts going after them. He's doing it right now with all of our children. It's much easier to get somebody at a young, ripe age when they're impressionable than it is where somebody's firmly established and they're in their comfort zone, right? These people are isolated. They're away from whatever good influences they had. But that's exactly how Satan works. The brainwashing, the indoctrination, the attack on our identity is happening right now all the time, I think. And I think we see Satan using a lot of these same strategies, the same kind of attack. Isolation. You think Satan wants to isolate us? You think it's a lot easier for him to get us when we're isolated? I mean, if you just think about the literal idea of being alone, don't we often sin when we're alone? When we think no one is watching, when no one's going to know, when no one's going to find out. That's a lot of times when our sin takes place, when we think it's in secret. I mean, if you think about, just go back to the very beginning when you had Adam, what did God say about Adam? It was not good for what? For him to be alone. All right? So Satan can certainly accomplish his goals much better when we're alone, when we're isolated. Indoctrination, I mean, similar to Babylon, Satan in the world is trying to indoctrinate us in all kinds of ways. We could talk about this for a long time, but we won't for sake of time. Identity, Satan's after our very identity. He wants us to forget who we are. If we're Christians, he wants us to not identify as a Christian. He wants us to just kind of forget about that. When we forget who we are, my mom used to say a lot of times when we left for school or when she dropped us off, remember who you are and what you are. All right, because if I remember I'm a Gainey, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, if that's part of my identity, it should shape how I'm going to live. If I forget about that, if I leave that at the door, I'm far less likely to do the right thing when the rubber meets the road. So let's talk about the rest of the chapter here. So let's pick up in verse 8. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. The commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has allotted your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking gaunt in comparison to the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. All right, so we have this dilemma that's created by the food here, okay? So what do we know about the food? Yeah, teenage boys love food, right? It's maybe, I think food can be a weakness for it. We don't often think of it as a spiritual weakness, but I think here there's a spiritual issue at play. But this is apparently good food because who else is eating it? The king's eating it. It's the king's food. It's the king's menu, so to speak. So if the king's eating it, it's probably pretty good stuff, right? It's probably pretty tasty food. The king had determined this was what was to be eaten, what was to be drank. So, as I think was mentioned earlier, if we're going to reject this now, we're rejecting the king's order and we're risking death. And you just read there that even the overseer is afraid of his own head if they were to refuse the food here. So we don't know exactly what's going on here, but obviously if Daniel and his friends were to eat it, they would have defiled themselves, we're told. So very likely it was unclean according to Mosaic law. You can go back in the law of Moses and look at all the different ordinances concerning food that they were not supposed to eat and ways in which things were supposed to be kept and prepared. More than likely it was also sacrificed to idols. And so whatever it may be, to eat it would have defiled themselves. That much is clear. It would have been blasphemy. It would have been against their their conscience. And so this creates this dilemma. All right, and that's how a lot of time, that's where the rubber meets the road for us. It's some kind of dilemma, some appealing choice to us that we want, but then something we know that is right. All right, and so here, to eat the food would defile them, but to refuse the food and do the right thing would risk death. All right. So let's think about this. There are a lot of reasons I think Daniel could give if he were to just go with the flow, eat the food, and move on. What are some reasons we could come up with for him to do that? Yeah, I mean, what good am I dead? Okay, all right. That's maybe the number one reason is I'll die if I don't. Okay. What else? What are some reasons why he might justify doing this? Yeah, you don't want to be rude. Yeah. Yeah. What else? Yeah, don't want to lose his position. He's away from home, right? Who's going to know? Everybody else is doing it. I mean, that's what we see in the story. Seemingly everybody else other than Daniel and his friends are eating it. Okay? I mean, do we really care about keeping the law anymore? I mean, what does it matter? Right? The temple, the temple's not destroyed yet, but who's going to know? Everybody else is doing it. We're away from home. All right? He's done the right thing so far, and where's that gotten him? Yeah. Right. He's done the right thing, and yet he's still in the same boat as everyone else who wasn't doing the right thing. Okay. You think some people might have thought it's not a big deal. It's just food, right? It's not a big deal. Isn't that kind of how sin works a lot of times? We think this one little thing is not a big deal. It's just between me and myself. Nobody else is going to know. Not a big deal. And suddenly that becomes one time, two times. It becomes something more serious. All right. There are a lot of reasons we can think of why he would do that. But as we read in verse 8, it says, "But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself." So if we were reading the story about some of these other young boys, if we were reading their biography, it would have read, and so Johnny ate the food and moved on. All right, but it says, but Daniel, instead of doing what we would expect, Daniel defies the norm. And what we read is that he made up his mind. He made up his mind. Another version may say, set upon his heart, purposed in his heart. I would suggest to you that the decision to not eat the food, to not defile himself, did not happen when he's got a knife and fork in his hand and he's about to raise a piece of pork or whatever it was to his mouth. Would you agree? I think this is a decision that happened before that moment, because if that's how we make our decisions, if we get all the way into the trap, we normally don't make the right decision. But what we read here is that he purposed in his heart. He made up his mind to do that. And so I think this is more to Daniel than just following rules. I think what Daniel's doing, he's making a decision based on a predetermined conviction to do the right thing, to remain faithful in all circumstances. I think Daniel had made up his mind that whatever happens, wherever I find myself on this journey, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm not going to be a Babylonian. I'm going to continue to be faithful to God. All right? he had a conviction in his mind, and that led to the decision to do the right thing. I think a lot about Joseph when I think about this story. You remember Joseph? A lot of parallels in the life of Joseph and the life of Daniel. Joseph, someone who's a great kid doing the right things, and really because he was more righteous than his brothers, finds himself a slave in Egypt. All right, we read that he excels, God's with him, a lot of the same things we read about Daniel. And yet there's this one problem. He's handsome, he's good looking, and his master's wife has set her eyes on him. And so she is repeatedly trying to get her to sleep with him and commit adultery. And yet we see Joseph resisting time after time. And what he says there in Genesis 39, in the moment when he's tempted, he says, "How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" Because what Joseph knew is that this is not something little. This is not something that's just between me and Potiphar's wife. It's sin against God. And it doesn't matter that nobody back home cares or knows. It's always between he and God. And so I think Joseph had this eternal perspective. I think Daniel has this eternal perspective. He's always got God at the front of his mind. Think about this quote. "Issues of ultimate moment deserve ultimate attention." Issues of ultimate moment deserve ultimate attention. That's just from a random fantasy novel, actually. It has nothing to do with the Bible. But it's always, and I wouldn't even recommend reading the book, but it's a quote that's always stood out to me. Issues of ultimate moment deserve ultimate attention. I think the idea is that something really important, an important decision, is not something you make on the fly. It's something you have to think about. And so, was this really an issue of ultimate moment? I mean, food? Was to Daniel. Yeah. And as we come to the end of the chapter, Daniel is going to serve for many years and be a major influential person in all these kingdoms because of this. But yes, it was a matter of following God. And it wasn't just going to start, it started with food, but it was going to transition to a lot of other things. Daniel's drawing the line in the sand right now. And so he had purpose in his mind. He had made up his mind to do the right thing. And so how do we resist temptation over and over again? We're not making that decision in the moment every time. We purpose in our minds to do the right thing in every circumstance. We have a plan. We draw a line in the sand, and we don't inch all the way up to it, get as close as we can. No, we avoid it altogether. So notice how Daniel makes this stand. Notice how he goes about doing the right thing. He's in exile, and he largely is compliant. He's largely doing what he can. He's in a lot of ways a good citizen, but he doesn't ever compromise, as we're going to see throughout the story. So you see that he seeks permission and he's respectful. All right. So he doesn't go about this by saying, "You wicked Babylonians, don't you know that God said this is unclean? Don't you know that it's wrong to sacrifice to these false gods?" He doesn't try to beat them over the head. Instead, he seeks permission for an exception to do this so that he can comply with his conscience, so that he can follow the law. All right. What does it say in verse 9? Who's helping Daniel out in this situation? God. All right. So we read that God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the officials. So he's not rebellious. He's not trying to cause problems. He's respectful. Verse 12, we see when he approaches them, he says, "Please." Okay. We attract more flies with honey than vinegar. Is that the same? All right. So I think this would have gone very differently if Daniel had just, tried to revolt over this. Daniel wouldn't have been, again, in this position that he finds himself at the end of the chapter if he'd gone about it a different way. So he seeks permission, he's respectful, and what we see again is that he's compliant, but he never compromises. And so I think you can refuse to conform, you can refuse to compromise while still being kind and loving. So as we talk about, how hostile our environment is to Christianity, as we talk about, how bad the world is getting, that doesn't give us an excuse to just be rude, be hurtful, because I don't think we're going to win souls. I don't think we're going to get very far in trying to promote the gospel by being unkind people. And I think that's what we see with Daniel and how he goes about this. If you think about what Paul says, and we're starting to run out of time, so we're of course going to have to continue next week, but if you think about Paul in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, he says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." So don't be like the world, or if you're Daniel, don't be like the Babylonians. Be different, be transformed. Paul goes on in verse 9 in chapter 12 of Romans to say, "Detest what is evil, cling to what is good." All right, so don't compromise, reject what is evil, reject sin. But then what he goes on to say in verse 14, "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse." Verse 17, "Never repay evil for evil to anyone." Verse 18, "If possible, so far as depends on you, be at peace with all people." And then you come to chapter 13, verse 1, and he says, "Every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God." Think about the government Daniel's living under. Think about the government that the Christians Paul is writing to are living under. If they can do this, if they can have the attitude Daniel has, then I certainly think we who may be living as exiles in our own way, and we'll pick up that discussion next week, certainly we can do it and go about it in the way that Daniel does. But we see that he does not remain silent. All right, so he's respectful. He doesn't unnecessarily cause problems, but he doesn't keep silent for the sake of being peaceful and avoiding conflict. He doesn't compromise his values, his faith. He doesn't remain silent when it comes to right from wrong and when his faith is at stake. And so there's going to be times in our life where we're facing that situation. It may be as simple as something like this, food. All right. Of course, you know, we're not under Mosaic law, so that's not really going to be an issue. But there may be something small, but it's a matter of faith, and we have to stand up and do the right thing. So as we look at the results, Daniel, of course, asked to be put to the test. They eat the vegetables and water and things like that. They don't partake of the food and the wine. And what's the result? Yep. It says in verse 15, "At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths." So I don't think our takeaway, if you want to lose weight, eat vegetables. No, I don't think that's the point. But I've heard of people doing the Daniel diet to lose weight, and I'm not sure that's what you want to do based on this, because they didn't seem to lose weight. So Daniel and his friends are healthier than those who ate the king's food. But what did we see amongst everyone else? What do? They give in, they defile themselves, they eat the king's food. And so all around Daniel and his friends, we have a close-knit group of believers, of faithful, but largely, even amongst the Jews, we have people that are conforming, that are compromising their faith. All right, and so we see at the end of 3 years, Daniel and his friends, they stand out. They're 10 times better than those around him. Daniel's able to interpret dreams and visions. Of course, that's going to be very relevant when we come to chapter 2. And we look at verse 21, it says, "And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king." So because Daniel did what he did, he's going to be in a position to influence some of the most powerful people that ever lived. And he's going to be a light in those kingdoms, an example of a godly person and a prophet of the one true God, because of his decision to remain faithful. We're going to talk, we're out of time, we're going to talk about some application from this next week, because we've kind of gone through it, but I think there's more we can say about some of the powerful lessons for us that we see here. So we'll finish up talking about chapter 1 and move into chapter 2 next week, so please read that to be ready for next week. Thank you.